The morning was bright, but inside his heart there was no sunlight. James Carter, a well-known black CEO, walked into the community center with his usual serious face. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. People whispered his name as he entered. For many, he was an untouchable figure, someone who lived in a world of meetings, deals, and power. Today, however, he had come for a charity event his company was sponsoring. He was there only because his board insisted it would improve the company's image. Children laughed and played in the large hall, their voices filling the air with joy. James walked through the crowd, nodding politely to the staff and organizers. He kept checking his watch, wishing the event would end soon so he could return to his office. His assistant handed him a folder with notes for his short speech. He had planned to speak, smile for a few photos, and leave quietly. But life rarely follows plans. As he stood near the refreshment table, a small hand gently pulled at his sleeve. Surprised, James looked down. There stood a little girl, no more than 8 years old. Her hair was tied into 2 braids, and her dress, though clean, looked a little worn. She had the kind of innocent eyes that could pierce through any armor. She stared up at him, nervous but determined. "Sir," she whispered softly, "could you pretend to be my daddy? Just for one day." The words froze him in place. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. All around, the laughter of children continued, but to James, the world went silent. He had faced tough investors, hostile boardrooms, and media questions, but nothing had prepared him for the simple, heartfelt request of a child. He cleared his throat. "What did you say?" His voice was softer than usual. The girl's lips trembled, but she repeated, "Please, just for one day. Pretend to be my daddy." James felt his chest tighten. He had no children of his own, and he had built walls around his heart for years. Yet in that moment, those walls cracked. He saw the hope in her eyes, a hope so deep it hurt to look at. He could have brushed it off, excused himself, or told her she had mistaken him for someone else. But something inside him refused to let her down. He bent down so his eyes were level with hers. "Why do you want me to be your daddy?" he asked gently. She looked down at her shoes, fidgeting with her fingers. "Because all the other kids have their daddies here. They take pictures with them. They laugh together. I don't have one. Just for today, I want to feel like I do." Her voice cracked at the end, and James felt a sting in his chest. He had come to the center as a businessman, but standing before this little girl, he was only a man faced with a truth too raw to ignore. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Lila," she answered. James nodded slowly. He glanced around. Some of the staff had noticed the scene but said nothing, waiting to see what he would do. He realized this wasn't about him anymore. It was about the little girl who had found the courage to ask a stranger for something most children take for granted. "All right, Lila," he said finally. "Just for today, I'll be your daddy." The smile that spread across her face was brighter than the morning sun outside. She reached out and grabbed his hand, holding it tightly as though afraid he might change his mind. For the first time in years, James felt a warmth he had forgotten existed. She pulled him into the crowd of children, proudly announcing, "This is my daddy." Her friends giggled, some looking surprised, but none questioned her. To them, it was just play. But to Lila, it was everything. James felt strange at first. He wasn't used to bending down, laughing, or letting go of his strict, polished image. Yet with every moment, he felt himself softening. He helped her with a puzzle, clapped as she sang a song, and even allowed her to feed him a cookie. The children laughed, and so did he. The sound of his own laughter surprised him. It had been so long since it came naturally. As the afternoon went on, James noticed little things. The way Lila looked at him with pride whenever she introduced him. The way she leaned against him with trust. The way she held his hand tightly, as though it gave her strength. He wondered what emptiness she must feel to ask a stranger for this. During a group photo session, the photographer asked for parents and children to stand together. Lila dragged James to the front. He stood stiffly at first, but when she wrapped her arms around his waist and leaned her head against him, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. The camera clicked, capturing an image that would stay in his heart forever. Later, as they sat on a bench outside the hall, Lila looked up at him. "Thank you," she said simply. James cleared his throat again, struggling to find words. "You're welcome," he managed. "But, don't you have someone? A father, maybe?" Her eyes clouded. She shook her head. "No. It's just me and Mommy. Mommy works a lot. Sometimes she cries. But I don't tell her I'm sad too. Today I just wanted to feel like the other kids." The honesty in her voice cut through him like a blade. He thought about his own childhood. He remembered nights when he had wished for a father to guide him, protect him, or simply be there. He had grown up without one, and that pain had driven him to succeed, to prove himself. But now, hearing Lila, he realized some wounds never truly heal. He looked at her small hands, still clutching his, and something stirred deep within him. He had always believed love was a weakness, that caring too much could distract a man from his goals. But sitting there with Lila, he wondered if maybe he had been wrong all along. As the day ended, the event coordinator approached him to thank him for attending. James nodded politely, but his mind was far away. He kept glancing at Lila, who was skipping around happily, showing her friends a paper flower she had made. When it was time to leave, Lila ran back to him. She hugged him tightly around the waist. "Goodbye, Daddy," she whispered. Her voice was soft but full of meaning. James froze, then slowly placed his hand on her back. "Goodbye, Lila," he said. His voice trembled in a way it never had in boardrooms or speeches. As he walked toward his car, he turned once more. Lila was waving, her smile wide, her eyes shining. He raised his hand and waved back. Driving away, James felt something inside him shift. He had come to the event to fulfill a duty. But he left with a memory that would haunt him in the most unexpected way. A little girl's innocent plea had broken through the walls around his heart. And though he had promised her only one day, deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of something far greater than he could imagine. The next morning, James Carter woke up earlier than usual. He tried to tell himself it was just another busy day ahead, filled with board meetings and phone calls. But his mind was not on his company. His thoughts kept circling back to the little girl from yesterday, Lila. Her small hand in his, her innocent eyes, her simple request that had shaken his entire world. "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy, just for one day?" Those words kept echoing inside him like music he could not turn off. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the edge of his bed, staring out the window at the city skyline. For years, this view gave him pride. To him, it was proof of what he had achieved: wealth, power, respect. Yet today, it all seemed empty. He wondered if this was the same emptiness Lila felt, looking at her friends with their fathers. By noon, James was in his office, but he couldn't concentrate. His assistant came in with documents that needed signing. He signed them absent-mindedly, his mind still stuck on the memory of that small girl calling him daddy. Finally, after hours of trying to force himself into work, he gave up. He picked up his phone, searched the number of the community center, and called. "Hello," he said when someone answered, his voice steady but softer than usual. "This is James Carter. Yesterday I attended your event. I met a little girl named Lila. Could you tell me if she comes there often? The woman on the other end paused for a moment, surprised. Yes, sir, Lila comes here regularly. Her mother works long hours, so she spends time with us after school. She's a sweet child. James hesitated before asking, do you think it would be possible if I visited her again? I just want to check in on her. The woman's voice warmed. I'm sure Lila would be very happy to see you again, sir. That afternoon, James cancelled his last meeting and drove back to the community center. His driver looked at him in confusion, because James never changed his schedule once it was set. But James said nothing, simply staring out the window as the car rolled through the streets. When he walked into the community hall, the children were busy painting. The moment Lila saw him, her face lit up brighter than any lamp. She dropped her paintbrush and ran toward him with such joy that the other children turned to see what was happening. Daddy, she shouted, wrapping her little arms around his leg. James froze for half a second, then gently patted her back. Something inside him softened at the sound of that word. He had only agreed for one day, but to her, it seemed like that promise had stretched into forever. Hello, Lila, he said warmly, bending down to meet her eyes. What are you painting? She held up her paper proudly. It was a messy but colorful picture of a girl holding hands with a tall man in a suit. That's me and you, she said. James felt his throat tighten. He carefully took the paper from her and smiled. It's beautiful. For the rest of the afternoon, James forgot he was a CEO. He sat on the floor with the children, helping them color, build blocks, and play games. The staff watched in surprise. They had never seen him laugh so freely. At snack time, Lila insisted he sit with her. She pushed a cookie into his hand and poured him juice from a small carton. You have to drink it, Daddy, she said with a serious face. That's what daddies do. James chuckled. All right then. If that's the rule, I'll drink it. He took a sip, and the children giggled. It was a simple moment, but to him it felt extraordinary. Later in the day, Lila tugged at his sleeve again. Will you come with me tomorrow? We have a school play. Everyone's daddy will be there. Her eyes searched his face, filled with hope. James hesitated. He had important meetings the next day. His calendar was full. But when he looked into her eyes, he knew he couldn't say no. I'll be there, he promised. The next day, James sat in the school auditorium surrounded by parents. For the first time in his life, he felt nervous in a way that had nothing to do with business. The curtains opened, and the children walked onto the stage. Lila was dressed as a flower, her smile bright and full of life. She kept glancing into the crowd, searching for him. When her eyes finally landed on James, her whole face lit up. She waved excitedly, and James raised his hand in return. When the play ended, Lila ran straight to him, her little costume rustling as she moved. Did you see me, Daddy? Did you see me? James bent down and hugged her. I saw everything. You were amazing. The other parents looked on curiously, whispering among themselves. Some recognized James Carter, the wealthy CEO, and wondered why he was sitting there with a child who wasn't his. But James didn't care. In that moment, nothing mattered except the little girl beaming up at him. After the play, Lila proudly introduced him to her teacher. This is my daddy, she declared. The teacher smiled politely, though a flicker of confusion passed across her face. James only gave a small nod, choosing not to correct the child. Somehow, hearing her say those words didn't feel wrong. It felt right, natural, even healing. They spent the rest of the evening together, walking to a small ice cream shop near the school. James let her pick 2 scoops of her favorite flavor, strawberry with sprinkles. She insisted on feeding him a spoonful. He laughed as she smeared a little on his chin. "Daddy, you're funny," she giggled. He wiped his chin with a napkin, still smiling. "I guess I am." As the sun began to set, James walked her back to the community center where her mother would pick her up. Lila held his hand tightly the whole way, chattering about her friends, her teacher, and her dreams. She told him she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, so mommy won't have to cry anymore. James listened silently, his heart aching. He realized this child carried more weight in her small shoulders than many adults did. She dreamed not of toys or vacations but of easing her mother's pain. When they arrived, Lila hugged him again. "Thank you for coming, Daddy. You made me so happy." James knelt down, looking into her eyes. "You made me happy too, Lila." As he drove home that night, the city lights blurred through his car window. He thought about all the times he had dismissed happiness as something childish, something that distracted from success. Yet in just 2 days, a little girl had shown him more joy than years of achievements ever had. Back in his penthouse, he looked around at the polished furniture, the expensive art, the silent rooms. The emptiness weighed heavily on him. He had everything, yet it meant nothing. For the first time, he realized he was lonely. Truly lonely. Lila had asked him to be her daddy for one day. But without meaning to, she had pulled him into a role he could not walk away from so easily. He had promised her tomorrow, and after that, he knew he would promise again. Because pretending was no longer enough. The next week, James Carter found himself thinking more about Lila than about any of his business deals. He had sat through meetings where men argued about numbers and contracts, but all he could hear in his mind was Lila's small voice calling him daddy. He had been a man who planned everything in life, yet nothing had prepared him for how deeply a child's innocent love could affect him. One evening, after a long day at work, James decided he needed to know more. He couldn't stop wondering about Lila's real life, her mother, her home, and why she had felt the need to ask a stranger to pretend to be her father. He called the community center again, and the same woman who had spoken to him earlier answered. "Hello," James began. "This is James Carter again. I've been visiting Lila at the center. I hope you don't mind me asking, but could you tell me a little about her family? I don't want to intrude, but I just want to understand." The woman hesitated, then spoke softly. "Lila's mother is a good woman. She works 2 jobs just to keep things going. She's doing her best, but it's hard. Lila's father, he left when she was very small. She doesn't remember him. It's just been the 2 of them for years." James sat silently, the words sinking deep into him. He thought about Lila's eyes when she asked him to be her daddy. That was not just a game for her. It was a cry from a little heart that wanted what others had but was missing in her world. "Do you think," James asked carefully, "her mother would mind if I met her?" The woman at the center paused again. "She might be surprised, but I think she would be grateful. I'll let her know you asked." The next day, James returned to the center. Lila ran into his arms the moment she saw him, her laughter echoing in the hall. She was holding a drawing of a house. When he looked at it, he saw 3 figures: a small girl, a woman, and a tall man in a suit. "That's you, me, and Mommy," she said proudly. James smiled, though his throat tightened. "That's beautiful, Lila." As they were talking, a woman walked into the room. She was in her early 30s, tired but graceful. Her clothes were simple, her hair tied back neatly. She carried herself with quiet strength, but James could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Lila ran to her, hugging her tightly. "Mommy, this is my daddy," she said without hesitation, pointing to James. The woman froze, her eyes widening. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then she gave James an awkward smile. I think there's some misunderstanding," she began softly. James raised his hands politely. Please forgive me. There's no misunderstanding. Your daughter asked me to be her father for a day during the event last week. I didn't want to disappoint her. I hope I haven't offended you. The woman's expression softened as she looked at Lila, who was beaming. I see. She's been saying things like that for a while. I guess she finally found someone who listened. I'm sorry, James said quietly. I didn't mean to cross a line. But I want you to know, your daughter is very special. She's smart, kind, and strong. The woman's eyes glistened. Thank you. It's been hard, raising her alone. Her father left when she was a baby. I work long hours, sometimes nights, and I know she feels lonely. But I didn't realize, she stopped, taking a deep breath. I didn't realize she would go to such lengths to fill that space. James nodded, understanding. I grew up without a father too. I know what that feels like. I know how heavy it can be on a child's heart. The woman looked at him curiously. You did? Yes, James admitted. And maybe that's why her words touched me so much. I couldn't say no to her. For the first time, the woman smiled genuinely. My name is Grace, she said, offering her hand. James, he replied, shaking it gently. That evening, James found himself sitting with Grace and Lila in the small cafeteria of the center. They talked about simple things: Lila's school, her favorite subjects, and how she wanted to be a doctor someday. Grace listened with pride, but James noticed the worry in her eyes when she spoke about money. She mentioned how sometimes she skipped meals so Lila could have enough, but she quickly brushed it off with a forced smile. James felt a heavy ache in his chest. He could afford anything: luxury cars, private jets, penthouses. But here was a child and her mother, living each day with sacrifices he couldn't imagine. After they parted ways, James drove home, his mind racing. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. He sat in silence, staring at the photo from the charity event that someone had sent him, the one where Lila was hugging him like he was truly her father. He remembered his own childhood, how he had dreamed of moments like that, and how he had promised himself that one day he would never feel powerless again. He had kept that promise, but the victory felt hollow tonight. The next weekend, James visited again. This time, Grace was there from the start. She looked hesitant but allowed him to spend the day with Lila. Together, they walked to a nearby park. James pushed Lila on the swings, helped her climb the slide, and even bought her cotton candy. Grace watched quietly, her arms crossed, her eyes softening little by little as she saw her daughter's joy. At one point, Lila ran ahead to play with other kids, leaving James and Grace sitting on a bench. You don't have to do this, you know, Grace said gently. You've already done more than enough. James shook his head. I want to. Lila has given me something I didn't even know I was missing. And honestly, I don't think I can walk away from her now. Grace studied him for a moment, as if trying to read his heart. You're a busy man. I saw your name in the papers. You run one of the biggest companies in the city. Why would you spend your time here, with us? James sighed. Because success feels empty when there's no one to share it with. For years, I thought money was the answer. But then your daughter looked at me with those eyes, and suddenly everything changed. She reminded me of what really matters. Grace looked down, her eyes glistening again. She misses having a father. Sometimes I worry it will leave a scar on her heart. James turned his gaze toward Lila, who was laughing as she ran across the grass. It doesn't have to, he said softly. That night, as James drove home, he felt a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The little girl had not only asked him to be her daddy, she had given him a reason to look beyond himself. And the mother, Grace, had shown him quiet strength he admired deeply. James lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, realizing that what had started as a pretend role was becoming something more. He had entered Lila's life as a stranger. Now, he felt bound to her in a way that scared him and yet gave him hope. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew one thing for certain: he could not simply walk away. Days turned into weeks, and what had begun as a moment of kindness slowly became a part of James Carter's life. Every evening, after his workday ended, he found himself driving not to high-end restaurants or private clubs, but to the small neighborhood where Lila lived. At first, he told himself it was just to check on her, to make sure she was all right. But soon, it became clear that he went because he wanted to, because being near her brought him peace that no boardroom could ever give. One evening, James arrived at the community center with 2 bags in his hands. Lila spotted him instantly and came running, her braids bouncing as she shouted, "Daddy!" She hugged him so tightly that he almost dropped the bags. He laughed, lifting her off the ground for a moment before setting her down. "What's in the bags?" she asked with curiosity. "Dinner," James said, smiling. "I thought maybe tonight we could all eat together." When Grace arrived after work, tired and a little surprised to see James still there, she hesitated at first. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. James shook his head. "I wanted to. Please, let me." That night, the 3 of them sat around a small table at the center. James unpacked the food, simple but warm dishes from a family restaurant he had asked to prepare extra portions. Lila was excited, chatting about school, her friends, and a book she was reading. Grace listened, smiling gently, though James noticed how her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. As the evening went on, Grace began to relax. She found herself laughing at James's stories, tales about his childhood, about how he had once tried to build a treehouse that collapsed within minutes. Lila laughed so hard she nearly spilled her juice. For James, the moment felt strangely perfect. He wasn't a CEO that night. He wasn't a man with endless responsibilities. He was just James, sitting at a table with a little girl who called him daddy and a woman who carried more strength than she knew. The next weekend, Lila had a soccer game at her school. She begged James to come. Without hesitation, he cleared his calendar, ignoring the raised eyebrows of his assistant. When he arrived at the small field, dressed casually in jeans and a jacket, the other parents stared in surprise. Many recognized him from newspapers and television, but few could believe he was sitting on the bleachers like any ordinary dad. "Go, Lila," he shouted when she ran across the field, kicking the ball with all her strength. His voice was full of excitement, louder than he had ever been at a company event. When Lila scored her first goal, she turned toward him, jumping with joy. "Did you see that, Daddy?" she screamed. James stood and clapped. "I saw it. You were amazing." Grace sat beside him, watching quietly. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply enjoy the scene, the sight of her daughter beaming, the sound of James's laughter, the warmth of something she hadn't felt in years. After the game, Lila ran to them and wrapped her arms around both James and her mother. "We're the best team," she said proudly. James knelt to her level. "Yes, we are." As time passed, James's visits became routine. He helped Lila with her homework, took her for ice cream after school, and listened to her endless stories about her favorite books and dreams. At night, when Grace worked late, he sometimes stayed with Lila until she fell asleep. He would sit in the small living room, looking around at the modest apartment, realizing how different it was from his world. Yet, it felt more like home than his penthouse ever had. One evening, while Lila was asleep, James and Grace sat across from each other with cups of tea. Grace looked at him seriously. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "You've already given us so much of your time. You don't owe us anything." James leaned back, his gaze steady. "I'm doing this because I want to. Lila, she means something to me. And you've worked so hard for her. You shouldn't have to carry all of it alone. Grace lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. For years, she had carried the weight of responsibility by herself. Having someone share even a small part of it felt both comforting and frightening. I just don't want her to be disappointed, she said finally. I don't want her to get too used to something that might not last. James's voice softened. I'm not planning to walk away. Grace looked at him, searching his face for the truth. What she saw there was not pity, but sincerity. Slowly, she nodded. The following weekend, James invited them both to a small family fair in the city. He didn't choose the fancy kind of event his colleagues attended. Instead, it was a simple fair with games, food stalls, and music. Lila was overjoyed. She rode the carousel 3 times, laughed at the clowns, and won a stuffed bear when James helped her at the ring toss. Grace walked beside them, her heart torn between happiness and caution. She watched James hold Lila's hand as they walked, saw how naturally he guided her, how gently he bent down to listen whenever she spoke. He didn't act like someone pretending anymore. He acted like someone who belonged. As the day ended, the 3 of them sat on a bench, sharing cotton candy. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Lila leaned against James, tired but smiling. Grace watched the 2 of them, her own heart softening despite her fears. That night, as James drove home, his driver glanced at him through the mirror. "Sir, you seem different these days." James smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." He thought about the life he had built, an empire of glass towers and numbers. Yet none of it compared to the warmth of a little girl's arms around his neck, calling him daddy. He had entered her world as a stranger, a man of power who thought he had everything. But now, he realized he had been missing the most important thing, love. The more he saw Lila, the more he felt like her father, not just in name but in heart. He couldn't imagine his days without her laughter, her questions, her trust. And with Grace, he found himself admiring her quiet courage, her strength to raise her daughter alone. He wanted to ease her burdens, not out of duty, but because he cared. One evening, as he tucked Lila into bed after reading her a story, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "you're not going to leave, right?" James's throat tightened. He brushed her hair gently. "No, Lila. I'm not going to leave." She smiled, her eyes closing as she drifted into sleep. James sat beside her for a long while, watching her breathe. In that moment, he understood that what had started as pretending was no longer pretend. It was real. It was family. The months that followed brought changes James Carter never imagined. His calendar, once filled only with meetings, dinners, and business calls, now had space marked for school events, park visits, and family dinners. People in his company began to notice. His once cold, distant personality had softened. He smiled more in the office, spoke more patiently, and even took time to listen to junior employees. Some thought it was a new leadership strategy, but the truth was far simpler. His life had been touched by the laughter of a child and the kindness of a woman who had never asked for anything from him. One Friday evening, James left work early to attend a community gathering. Grace and Lila were waiting for him outside the small hall, both dressed in their best clothes. Lila wore a blue dress with a ribbon, and Grace wore a simple but elegant outfit that made her look both strong and graceful. When Lila spotted him, she ran into his arms shouting, "Daddy!" Without thinking, James lifted her up and spun her around. He didn't care about the curious looks from others. To him, she wasn't pretending anymore, she was truly his little girl. Inside the hall, families gathered together. Lila proudly walked with James holding her hand, introducing him to everyone. "This is my daddy," she repeated with joy. Some people were surprised to hear her say that, but the warmth in her voice left no room for doubt. James felt something he had never felt in all his years of success: belonging. During the program, James gave a small speech when asked to share his thoughts. Instead of speaking about his company or wealth, he spoke about love. "We measure life in numbers too often," he said softly. "But real value isn't in numbers. It's in the moments we share with the people who matter." His words touched the audience, and Grace's eyes filled with quiet emotion as she listened. After the event, James walked with Grace and Lila to their apartment. The streets were calm, the air cool. Lila skipped ahead, humming happily, while James and Grace walked side by side. For a moment, it felt like they had always been together. When they reached the apartment, Grace paused before opening the door. She looked at James seriously. "You've done more for us than I ever thought anyone would. But I need to ask you, is this real for you?" "Because for Lila, it is. She sees you as her father now. And if you ever step back, it will break her heart." James looked into her eyes, his voice steady. "It's real. I came into this thinking it was for a day, but she changed my life. I don't want to be just a visitor in her world. I want to stay." Grace's eyes softened, though tears threatened to fall. She nodded, and for the first time, she let her guard down. From that day forward, James became more than just a presence. He became part of their family. He attended parent-teacher meetings, helped Lila with her science projects, and even learned how to braid her hair, though he wasn't very good at it. Grace teased him gently, and Lila laughed so hard she nearly fell off her chair. The apartment, once filled with silence and weariness, now echoed with laughter, warmth, and hope. One evening, Grace invited James to dinner at their home. She had cooked a simple meal, and they sat together at the small table. Lila chattered away as usual, telling stories about school. James watched them both, his heart full. When Lila left the table to fetch a drawing she had made, James looked at Grace. "I want to do more," he said quietly. "Not just for a day or a week. I want to give you both the security you deserve. I want to be here not just as a visitor, but as family." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the table. "Do you mean that, James?" "I've never meant anything more," he replied. In that moment, Grace realized he was no longer the distant CEO she had once read about in newspapers. He was a man who had found love where he least expected it. Weeks later, at another community event, a volunteer asked Lila who the man beside her was. Lila smiled brightly, her little hands wrapped around James's arm, and said with complete pride, "That's my daddy." The words echoed in James's heart. He felt a lump in his throat as he looked down at her. For years, he had believed he didn't need anyone, that success was enough. But standing there with Lila and Grace, he knew the truth. Love had given him more strength than power ever could. That night, as James walked Grace and Lila home, he realized something else. He wasn't just filling a space in their lives, they were filling one in his. The empty rooms of his penthouse no longer felt like home. Home was here, in the laughter of a little girl and the quiet strength of her mother. When they reached the apartment, Lila hugged him tightly. "Good night, Daddy," she whispered. James bent down, kissed her forehead gently, and replied, "Good night, my little star." As he walked back to his car, he knew his life had changed forever. He was no longer just a CEO, no longer just a man chasing success. He was a father, a protector, and part of a family that had healed wounds he didn't even know were still open. One innocent question from a little girl had changed everything. "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy, just for one day?" What began as pretend had become the most real and beautiful chapter of his life. And this time, there would be no ending.